Sven, come on up. Keep the applause going for Sven over here. All right, man, looking dapper, looking good. We have been talking about a bunch of stuff from life in Berlin, not as much of a party city as you expected. Also, why do German trains run slower and delayed and Swiss trains don't, even though the trains come from here? Lots of good conversation, but your real passion is blockchain. And you're the editor-in-chief of the largest German-speaking publication on blockchain. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I was fascinated by Bitcoin in 2015, and I think everything is going digital, including our money. And blockchain technology means, for me, it's the internet of value, and it will change everything. And I want to be part of it, of this. So this is my passion, and this is why I write every day about the scene and the things that are happening so fast.
And you are an expert, that you've been nominated as an expert. You're an advisor to the UN. You have so many different roles that you play. And now you're going to be the moderator for this conversation over here. So enjoy the next couple minutes. And hopefully Richard and Erwin have got some water. They're ready to go. So the amazing red chair is yours. And our crew over here, could you please give a hand to our panelists as they come up on stage?
So Dan, thanks for the lovely introduction. I feel highly energized now. I hope you too, because I'm looking forward now to a critical discussion about the role of CBDCs, central bank digital currencies in general, and of course in particular for the token economy. And when you may think about CBDCs, you will not only think about programmable money that brings us higher level of digitalization, you might also think about a dystopia. A dystopia we can already be seen in China. Accordingly, I would like to cover the whole spectrum of the CBDC discussion, and in the end you can decide what's your own opinion about the CBDCs. And I'm pleased that we are discussing this controversial topic with two absolute money experts. And that would be, on the one hand, Erwin Voloder, who is an economic data analyst at the European Central Bank. He's also an advocate for the digital euro in the Digital Euro Association and works with the European Blockchain Association to raise awareness and create a political lobby for the blockchain economy. And then, on the other side, I'm looking forward to Professor Dr. Richard Werner, who's working on a decentralized autonomous organization, the Valhalla network. We could hear already your keynote right now, a few minutes ago. I hope you have also some energy left now for this panel, and there were many very interesting aspects I think we could integrate now also in our panel discussion. So therefore, I would like to say, let's start. And yeah, everything is going digital, including our money. And my first question would be, is digital central bank money as a consequence unavoidable, or are there any reasons why CBDCs won't establish in this decade as the standard?
Well, thank you for having me here. I would just first like to give a disclaimer that I'm not speaking on behalf of the ECB today, so sorry to disappoint for those who want behind-the-scenes insights on perhaps the digital euro. I am here on behalf of the European Blockchain Association, so I will speak more liberally. I think that that's a bit of a misnomer, because you have, according to an Atlantic Council research study, there's about 105 jurisdictions representing roughly 95% of global GDP that are already working on CBDC projects of various sorts. You have some that have already launched: Nigeria's Naira, the ECNY out of Beijing, and then you have Project Sand Dollar, for an example. There's also various POCs through the BIS Innovation Hub, Project Intanon Lion Rock, Project Dunbar, Rosalind, Icebreaker, which launched 2 weeks ago, which is quite interesting. So to the extent that they're inevitable, I mean, yeah, they will come, and they already have in some shape or form. The question is, for what purpose, in which country, and for who? I think that that's the greater question, if you agree with me. I'm of the view that not only are CBDCs inevitable, but so are stablecoins. for that matter. I think that digital currency areas, the Brunmeier paper, for example, is an excellent iteration of that, is likely the world that we are going to face, and digital currency competition is the next iteration of, let's say, geopolitical tail risk. So with that being said, the two sides of the coin are unavoidable, in my opinion.
I'm very curious about your opinion, Richard. I heard before you're not a big fan of CBDCs and central bank money.
Well, CBDCs, I mean, actually, I agree in particular parts of what you've said very much. For example, I will also say that CBDCs are inevitable, but I would continue the sentence, if we let the central planners be in charge. Because, of course, that's what the central planners want, and that's why all these projects are led and supported by the central planners at the central banks, at the BIS, at some AstroTurf organizations indirectly funded by central banks, and so on. And of course, they get their people into various organizations, and that's how they've done in economics to get the false interest rate economics spread. And so it's a good sort of very well-established network. The other word I'd borrow is misleading terminology. Namely, yes, CBDCs themselves are a misnomer. Why? Because, well, for several reasons, but one is it gives the impression that, oh wow, this is something new, CBDC, wow, digital currency. Well, we've been using digital currencies for decades. All our money is digital, is bank money. So BDCs, bank digital currencies, we've been using, and there's no problem with it. It operates very well. Except, actually, since 2008, the central planners have started to undermine the operations of private sector decentralized providers of digital currencies, the banks, by, for instance, carving out the payment system as a separate function, creating separate payment regulators, giving out separate licenses to non-banks to be electronic currency issuers, and so on. So you see, this is all very top-down. It reminds me of the story when I was in Japan in the 90s, and I had lunch with the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, now METI official, and he explained to me how football, soccer, was introduced in Japan. The ministry decided, well, the Americans are telling us we need to expand domestic demand and consumption, so we need to think of ways to doing that. Well, let's introduce another sport, not just baseball, which had been dominating as a Western sports. Of course, there's sumo wrestling, and so they had a plan, and top down from zero, they designed everything. We will have clubs here and there. We'll have an association. There will be advertising. There will be venues. There will be this, that, and the other. Recruitment, training, all top down, planned and introduced, and that's how football, soccer came to Japan. It's like that with CBDCs. So this doesn't really answer the question. The question is, do we really need CBDCs? And of course, the answer is no. We have digital currencies, and a lot of us want decentralized systems that protect our anonymity and give people freedom of choice, whereas CBDCs are quite the opposite.
Okay, so we have two different opinions, I think, so far, but now I would like to concentrate on the Chinese CBDC. It's the most famous one. It's already working in some regions there, but it's not based on a blockchain, what we would define as a blockchain. So do you see any argument that states or central banks will use in the future real blockchains for CBDCs? Is that an option?
Well, looking at the Chinese, the ECNY, first of all, it's programmable. It may not be decentralized, but it's programmable. It can silo store value functionality. They had an airdrop recently to virus-stricken regions because they shut everybody down for over 50 days. They decimated the retail sector. So what they did was they did an airdrop of ECNY, but they carved it out in a certain way such that you had to spend it in retail stores to directly stimulate aggregate demand. And the problem with QE was that, number one, the Cantillon effect, and number two, people would just save the money and they wouldn't spend it. So you might have had an increase in the money supply, but you didn't have an increase in the velocity. And so that's what they tried to avoid with this, and it's essentially Friedman's helicopter money, but in some weird kind of dystopian way. I don't know whether Western governments would be so quick to use that kind of switch, although it is an unconventional means of monetary policy. Also, you have to look at certain projects that are currently underway are already implementing blockchain-based systems. You have Stellar for CBDCs, you have Quorum, you have Hyperledger Fabric. You can make an argument that Hyperledger Indy for digital identity could be linked to that as well. And then you have Quorum. So that's already it's not only in the literature, it's in the proof of concepts.
Well, what I'd like to know, you talk about programmable money. Is it really the programmable money itself, or are these the programmable infrastructures we are talking about? It's not the same, or?
Well, you have programmable money and you have programmable payments.
Yeah.
Programmable payments are the things that allow the complicated business logic to be settled in programmable money. You cannot have, in a retail CBDC, for example, one without the other. But I will agree to your point that if you're looking at a CBDC, we should distinguish between retail, wholesale, and synthetic. A synthetic CBDC, to your point, or BDCs, if you want a programmable version, could be a tokenized commercial bank deposit, a tokenized money market fund. That's something that the market can already provide. So to the extent that do you need a retail CBDC, that's not my decision to make. I'm just trying to look at it objectively. I think that wholesale CBDCs for interbank settlement of reserves, bilateral clearing, foreign exchange trading, margin settlement, I think that that's an interesting avenue to explore, and there's plenty of use cases for that already in play. And that has nothing to do with what's happening on the retail side, right? That's more for the high-value payments, the terms of trade, e-invoicing, e-receipts, etc. And that's where it has a robust use case. If you look at the e-Naira, which launched in Nigeria, 0.01% of the population is using it. So that comes down to the state. If you have a broken fiscal system, weak monetary policy transmission, and you're trying to issue a CBDC, if your citizens don't trust you as a government, they're not going to use your retail CBDC. And in Nigeria, they use their mobile banking payments, or they're just going to hold US dollars. So you have if you have a reputational problem as a government and you issue a retail CBDC, it's going to obviously impact the way that it's accepted. And if people don't trust you, then you're already facing an uphill battle.
I think trust is also very important when we talk about stable coins.
Sure.
And could you imagine that there is a coexistence in the future between private stable coins and CBDCs, or is it just a temporary phenomenon, what we are seeing right now, because we don't have CBDCs? What's your take on this?
On this theme of coexistence, and that goes back to your point just now, I mean, the good news is that it seems that the central planners around June this year made a decision, largely in Europe, possibly centered in Frankfurt, in the extraterritorial enclave known as the ECB, that they will not introduce, in the first instance, retail CBDCs. And that's good news because that means the culling of banks is going to be slowed. Because this will be if you have retail CBDCs, that's an accelerator to kill banks and essentially then introduce the Soviet system where all the banks are being killed and there's only the ECB left, which the central planners love, but they realize there's a bit of opposition to that. And so they have made the announcement informally through the Financial Times in June, saying that, okay, actually now it's going to be wholesale CBDC. So that's why you'll hear a lot about wholesale CBDC. That decision itself, of course, wasn't made by us or in any democratic means. I mean, we are talking about an undemocratic institutional framework called the European Union with an even more undemocratic, fairly totalitarian external monetary system that manages the euro, which is a foreign currency for every member of the Eurozone, a foreign currency run by an institution that's not accountable to any government, but also not to any parliament in Europe. Anyway, so they've made this decision for us that they're now going to give the banks a bit more time and they're going to have wholesale CBDCs. So that's an important point. Therefore, coexistence, yes, for now, with the banks. But of course, the switch can be turned very quickly at some stage when they want to move to retail and the banks are gone. We have to be aware of that. And that's where we have to think of alternative, decentralized systems, and that's where a combination between a token framework that is truly, based on people's democratic decisions and free decisions, and decentralized banking system is very powerful, which is what we're doing at the Valhalla network. But it's very important to think about this coexistence, and I think with stablecoins and other tools you can develop, it's a similar question, because ultimately the central planners have a goal, and you always have to be aware of that goal. And since perhaps a lot of people since March 2020 have been quite confused about what's going on in the world, just keep that in mind as a guideline. The central planners want to centralize and increase their power. That was the overarching trend of the 20th century, more power in the hands of the central planners. And Sovietization is the other key word. Anything that you've seen in the Soviet Union, central planners, adopting, is probably what they're after. And in that context, you're going to debate, oh, are we going to have stable coins or not? It's always going to be towards that end.
But then, Richard, if I understand you correctly, the best thing from a political standpoint would be to have stable coins from the banks, because then we have the decentralized network we have right now, and it's not the centralization through one state or through one central bank. So therefore, stable coins are more, for the system, more stable than CBDCs, because we have a market infrastructure which is like between, you would say, maybe capitalism and communism a little bit. So therefore, CBDCs are not good, huh, Erwin?
Okay, so back in May, I participated, and if you were here for Dr. Schwerin's presentation at the beginning of the day, in a working group that was organized in partnership by the Commission and the Bankenverband called Tokenize Europe 2025, where we looked at programmable money solutions. And we had commercial banks that were here, and the overarching theme of that was that programmable money can be provided by the commercial banks as they currently stand today. And if you look at the way MiCA has fallen, Article 32 on reserves and Article 36 that essentially bans interest-free money tokens that are privately issued, the only way that you can have an interest-bearing asset reference token, as it's defined, is like I said, it's either a tokenized commercial bank deposit or a tokenized money market fund. Now that's important because the money market fund argument is a little tricky, because if you look at the way that reserve primary fund fell in 2008, no equity capital buffer, no discount window, and no mandate for creditors to step in when things got hairy. And if you compare that, for example, to the Terra Luna situation, they had this BTC treasury that they couldn't really access due to poor governance. So if you then allow that to the commercial banks, which have access to lender of last resort facilities, and if you go back to the ECB's policy on the use of pre-funding by ancillary systems, it essentially bans privately issued stable coins from access to Target 2 for the purpose of reserves. So commercial banks are regulated financial institutions, they have access to Target 2, and they have lender of last resort facilities, right? So access to that. So that, with respect, could be a way to have a happy compromise in Europe. And these things could be programmable, and they could be used for a whole swath of things, from in the future to machine payments, fractionalization, streaming money, asset tokenization, etc. So I'm a big fan of that idea. I don't think it needs to exist in a vacuum. I think it could coexist with a wholesale CBDC. But I do agree with Richard in that competition is healthy. Crowding out private money, crowding out public money, or public money crowding out private money, that's no good for anybody, really, and it makes the job for whether you're in an essential institution or whether you're in the private sector difficult. So choice for consumers is what's important, I feel, because I am, at the end of the day, a consumer, and so is everybody in this room. So I don't think that that's a nail in the coffin, so to speak. I would say that we, by virtue of us even having this discussion and the fact that decentralization is such an important topic on the heads of everyone, that means that there's enough swing momentum in a different direction, perhaps.
But when we talk about, let's say, retail CBDCs, not wholesale CBDCs, do you think there will be an interoperability that I have my CBDC, the digital euro, for example, on the crypto exchange, on Binance, on Coinbase, I can use for trading, or do you think it's a different system with no interfaces to the pure crypto world?
I think that, okay, so we had a working group here yesterday in what stage 2 right now, and we were speaking about this idea of on and off ramps for decentralized finance. And the important point, you have different kinds of users. You have people that are very adept at using DeFi networks. They understand how to set up a MetaMask wallet. They know how to use DEXs. They know how to arbitrage. But then you have people that aren't really that astute and may not like the idea of perhaps using a stablecoin. So if you can have some way to make a CBDC fungible for the on and off ramps to DeFi for those users who might not be willing to, or for, I'll be the devil's advocate here, maybe not trust the stablecoin, but trust the retail CBDC, because there are people that do that, then that is a market for them. And again, I don't think that you should just crowd that out and say, well, we're only going to use Wrap BTC or BNB or Binance Smart Chain for this or whatever. By the way, it costs $2.9 million to be a node validator on the BNB Smart Chain. So to the extent that you argue CBDCs are centralized, certain infrastructures that are currently in the blockchain space are highly centralized. Lido Finance, Kraken Digital Asset Exchange, and Coinbase validated somewhere between 40 and 60% of all of the blocks post-merge on Ethereum, the first 400 blocks. So this is case in point that if we want to have a discussion about decentralization, okay, let's get to the meat and potatoes then.
Yeah. Richard, do you see any other maybe advantages for the token economy regarding to CBDCs, maybe also to your approach at Valhalla Network, where it could work out?
Well, there is the advantage that essentially the central planners, they needed to support initially tokens and digital currencies and even Bitcoin itself. And if you look into the history of the Bitcoin, you will find a certain affinity to the NSA and CIA. So because they know that in order to get where they want to get, they have to create this alternative space, which is also a good way of tying up a lot of resources and young minds to something that ultimately they can control. And that's what we always have to be aware of. And so we have to have our own exit plans and strategies for when the central planners take off the sheep's clothing that the wolves have put on to attract the sheep, right? So that's really the background. And so there is a certain phase where the environment is friendly. And I think in some domiciles, this has been enshrined in the law, and Liechtenstein, I think, is a friendly domicile. But that's not always going to be true, and everywhere in other domiciles is not going to be true. And the CBDCs, the existence of CBDCs and the ultimate power goal of increasing power, human nature being what it is, we know that that's ultimately what they're going to revert back to. Maybe it will take a long time, we don't know. Maybe it'll at some stage go very quickly, but you have to be aware of that. So my attitude is, let's use the time and resources while we can and use them wisely, carpe diem, but be aware of the risks and always be aware of what the central planners want and what they ultimately want to do, and then we can position ourselves.
And what do you think, or both of you, how will the world look like in the year 2030? Will our financial system more decentralized than today or more centralized? I mean, we got the CBDCs, which are maybe a more centralized version of our financial markets and money system, but also some open blockchain projects and DAOs, for example, which could lead to a more decentralized way. So not what you wish for, but what do you think will happen in, let's say, in the year 2030? Briefly, maybe because we have not much time and I have so many questions here.
Okay, well...
Oh no, Dan, come on.
I'll be brief.
He's showing me right now that there's no more time. You can answer this.
I'll be brief. I think that the world of 2030 will likely look somewhat similar to that, either happy or begrudging compromise that I mentioned earlier. I don't think that either a truly decentralized system or an overly paternal centralized system is likely to take root, simply because people around the world have very different proclivities and people are not rational and they're not rational with their money. So when you're dealing with something that's that confounding, it becomes extremely difficult to centralize to the extent that Richard had mentioned, at least in the democratic West, without an extreme use of force. And if you don't buy the Tillian argument that the state is a sole arbiter of the monopoly on violence, then they can't hold a gun to your head to make you use something if you don't want to. You can always barter, if that's the case, trade butter for sugar. And then you're faced with things that have sliding values from day to day, which was the reason we didn't have barter.
Okay, so last famous words, Richard. We are running out of time. I have too many questions here in my hand. Unfortunately, we have to open the stage.
Yes.
So very briefly, please.
The future is not written, and the central planners have their plans, but we also have a lot of influence, and that's why we have to fight for our future. And I think we have to do as much as we can to ensure a decentralized system and decentral banking. Because history tells us that is more successful, it's more resilient, it's more democratic, people are happier, and any centralization ultimately leads to disaster and totalitarian excess control and, as you mentioned earlier, a dystopian future. So we have to write the future. We have to speak up at events like this, in many other ways, also through what we do with our money, and back decentralization. Of course, we're doing this at the Valhalla network, where there's also the combination of a DAO, as you mentioned, with voting rights and the establishment of community banks.
Thanks a lot for your valuable insights. That was great. And Dan has always come nearer and nearer and nearer and nearer. So
Yeah,
I have
I'm
to
gonna
stop
sit on
now.
your lap at some
I'm
point.
afraid that you're sitting here in my chair right now. So thanks a lot.
Let's
And
give it
over
up for
to
the
Dan.
panel. Gentlemen, thank you so much.